Two Aussies run their way to 70.3 world titles in Vegas. TriCenter starts now. Welcome to TriCenter. I'm Ann Westling. The move of the Ironman World Championship 70.3 race from Clearwater to the outskirts of Las Vegas was welcomed by both professionals and age groupers. The change in venue and date offered a more difficult course during a more desirable time of the season. The pre-race chatter centered largely around topics like how athletes would fare on the difficult course and would the threat of triple-digit temperatures come to fruition. Well, race morning was filled with the anticipation you would expect at a World Championship event. Athletes arrived as the sun rose over the Nevada desert to finalize their transitions. Thankfully, temperatures hovered in the low 70s, sparing athletes from the potential brutal heat. But expectations for the race were high as athletes like former 70.3 world champions Craig Alexander, Andy Potts, and Julie Dibbins were making the start. Other athletes gunning for the world title included triathlon newbie Melissa Rollison, super cyclist Chris Lieto, and Aussie speedsters Paul Matthews and Joe Gambles. The Trek K-Swiss contingent had a significant presence at the race, with all 8 athletes making the start. As the clock approached 6:30, the male pros made their way into Lake Las Vegas and towards the in-water swim start. Now, no wetsuits were allowed in this race as the water temperatures stayed in the low 80s throughout race week. Once the cannon went off, the pros began their 70.3-mile journey towards the finish line in Henderson. As is almost always the case in any race he enters, Andy Potts went out hard on the swim and established a large gap on the field. Potts exited the water in just over 23 minutes. He was followed by Kevin Collington and then a large pack that included most of the main contenders. The first transition of this race was almost an endurance event of its own. After exiting the swim, athletes ran around the lake on a makeshift bridge before finally arriving at T1 and collecting their bikes. Strong cyclists like Chris Lieto, Joe Gambles, and Luke Bell made quick time in transition and looked determined to ride down the stronger swimmers. For the women, it was 2 Brits, Leanda Cave and Julie Dibbins, leading the efforts out of the swim and through the first transition. As the women exited the grounds of Lake Las Vegas, athletes like Melissa Rollison, Heather Jackson, and Lindsay Corbin rode hard to keep the gap between them and Dibbins to a minimum. The 56-mile bike course was the most talked about section of the race leading up to the event. Athletes rode out of Lake Las Vegas and eventually arrived at the Lake Mead National Recreational Area, where they were greeted with scenic views and lengthy climbs and descents. It didn't take long, though, for the main pack to swallow Potts up. Chris Lieto kept a steady pace before making his move and breaking away from the field. Craig Alexander fared well on the tough course as the man they call Crowy stayed at the front of the main pack throughout the entire ride. Lieto was the first to rack his bike in T2, aware that Alexander was riding well. Lieto made the switch from bike to run very quickly and started the final 13.1 miles of the race. Paul Ambrose was next into transition, with Alexander not far behind in third. For the women, the journey to T2 resulted with Dibbins holding the lead. What must have scared Dibbins and the rest of the women's field was the fact that Melissa Rollison, known for her background as an elite runner, was not far behind Dibbins in second coming off the bike. The Henderson-based run course did not showcase spectacular scenery, but it did feature 3 out-and-back loops through residential neighborhoods, giving spectators the opportunity to see athletes 6 times on the run. The men's race became a game of calculations as Lieto started the half marathon with nearly a 4-minute lead over Alexander. Would Alexander catch Lieto like he so famously did in the 2009 Ironman World Championship? Unfortunately for Lieto, the answer was yes. Alexander passed Lieto towards the end of the second lap, and despite relinquishing his lead, Lieto maintained strong form. Behind the pair, athletes like Paul Matthews, Joe Gambles struggled to keep pace and worked to maintain a top 10 position. On the women's side, the battle was over quickly as Melissa Rollison cruised through the hills of Henderson and Julie Dibbins struggled to keep any speed and eventually dropped out. In the end, it was Craig Alexander who earned his second 70.3 world title. Lieto cruised in for second, with young Canadian Jeff Simmons turning in the race of his career to earn third. Melissa Rollison, who discovered triathlon just over a year ago, added the world title to her resume. Karen Thurig, known for cycling skills, had a strong run to finish second, and American Lindsay Corbin, in her first race since May, took third. That's all for this race wrap-up edition of TriCenter. We'll leave you with sights and sounds from the race. Thanks so much for watching.
Whoa, those are some runs!